Let's talk a little bit about musical tastes. You've probably met people in your life that have what you might describe as a basic taste in music. You might actually feel like one of these people yourself, that your taste in music is somehow limited or underdeveloped. But whether it's you or somebody that you know, there's nothing wrong with this. You've committed no crime. It would be totally okay to listen to nothing but like top 40 pop forever until you die. There's nothing wrong with that. But you might just very occasionally feel that you're missing out on something. Or maybe you don't, and you're completely content with what you listen to. And that's a really important bit. Keep that in mind, because I'll come back to that later in this video. With that being said, there's definitely a group of music listeners out there that really only listen to music that's around them in their environment. For a lot of people, this can be what their friends are listening to, or what's on the radio, or what's on TikTok. This group of music listeners develops an interest in artists or certain styles passively, meaning the music comes to them. And as we'll see in just a moment, this isn't just my opinion. This is actually a fairly well-researched aspect of personality. Now, certain elements of the internet, mostly music nerds and genre purists, have developed a fascination with people who experience music in this way, sometimes referring to them as musical NPCs. Essentially, these are supposed to be people with musical tastes that are so mundane and uncurious that they're moving through their musical life like NPCs in a video game. They just do what their programming tells them to and little else. Now, of course, there's a seriously condescending undertone to all of this. People with a so-called basic taste in music are real people with agency and curiosity, or maybe they're just so busy they don't have the time to listen to, In Rainbow's extended edition or whatever. But I have to admit, I do share this fascination to some extent. Of course, this is mostly because I myself love music, and it just seems like such a fundamental part of the human experience that I can't imagine not wanting to find more, good shit. But I really don't like this condescending attitude. It's kind of mean. I'd like to look at this phenomenon a little bit more dispassionately. And after some research, I think I found a more accurate and definitely less insulting way to describe this group of people, and I'm calling it the I like what I like musical preference. Now again, there's nothing wrong with this, but it is what you hear, right, when someone's getting defensive about trying something new. I mean, everybody experiences this to some extent. You've probably heard a song that when you first listened to it, you really didn't like it, and maybe that was for a long time, but after, several dozen listens, you just kind of get it. This phenomenon is fascinating to me. And it's been heavily studied by psychologists, sociologists, and even musicologists. And this seems to be at the heart of the whole musical NPC thing. It's called the mere exposure effect, or more commonly, the familiarity principle. I'm about to sinfully oversimplify this. Basically, the understanding of this effect is that your brain doesn't really like things that it can't predict, albeit with some really important caveats. For example, when you're listening to Kenny Loggins' I'm Alright for the millionth time, which I'm definitely not guilty of, you know exactly what's coming up, what's next, and when it's going to happen. And this predictability is psychologically comfy. It feels safe. Conversely, when you're listening to a song that you haven't heard before, your brain has to work a little bit harder. Doesn't know what's coming up next. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this effect isn't that perfect. And it's certainly not that simplistically universal. Even when it was first observed, it was clear that more study was needed. For example, what about repeated exposure? I mean, over and over and over again. Will you just keep liking something more and more to infinity? Of course not. No, there's clearly a point of diminishing returns. And we've all had this experience with songs. We loved it once, it was on the radio too much, and now we can't listen to it. Or maybe it takes a couple years and you come back to it and you're like, man, the Bee Gees are awesome. But what I'm really interested in, and what I find the most compelling, is that if this is true, that certain forms of stimulus with a certain amount of exposure increases your enjoyment, even considering the caveat of exposure to boredom. Wouldn't this kind of program you to be more curious about music? For me, and for a lot of the people I know, there's serious pleasure in finding new things to enjoy. And how could that not sound good, right? That's where this fascination comes from, I think. And for some people, I think this confusion can turn into, I don't know, like a hate almost. Or maybe even like a form of self-validation, like, I'm curious about this, so I'm better, something like that. And there will always be some creative types that look down on this group of people. But there is a reason why they don't branch out. And it's not because they're stupid, and it's not because they're less interesting people. It's because the mere exposure effect, the familiarity principle that we talked about earlier, it doesn't apply to everyone in the same way. In 2010, a University of Toronto study looking at how the mere exposure effect related to music focused on how the effect manifests among individuals who have differing levels of what psychologists call openness to experience. Now, openness to experience is a descriptor of personality. It correlates to a ton of different preferences. Social and political beliefs, what you like to eat, even perhaps your level of religiosity. But in this study, they were looking specifically at how your level of openness to experience might affect the strength of the mere exposure effect, the strength of the familiarity principle. In a very basic summary, it found that participants who were more open to new experience kind of got bored faster, but also they had a faster acceptance and appreciation of new music. On the other hand, people with low openness to experience took longer to like new music. It took more exposure to enjoy new sounds. And previous studies showed that people who weren't very open to new experiences were much more likely to enjoy conventional music, aka pop music. Whereas people who were more open to experience were much more likely to enjoy elite music, so basically jazz and classical, even though they may also enjoy pop music. And it's kind of funny because when I was researching this video, I was immediately thinking about jazz. I have a video on jazz, specifically designed for the jazz hesitant. And in that video, I talk about how the more you're exposed to certain sounds, the more you have a context and the better you understand how they fit into the song, how they fit into the genre. And basically that increases your enjoyment. And that directly ties into the familiarity principle, because jazz is often, but not always, extremely improvisational, meaning you really don't know what's coming up next. It's like poison for the familiarity principle. It robs your brain of its beloved predictability. And if you have a much weaker response to the mere exposure effect, if you're much less open to experience, it's going to be much more difficult for you to enjoy jazz. And I think this is one of the big reasons why jazz is often considered an acquired taste, because for a lot of people, it really is, and it's sometimes very difficult to acquire. That being said, even those with low openness to experience, with some degree of exposure, should be able to increase their enjoyment, at least a bit. So don't think you can't enjoy jazz just because you like Taylor Swift, or because on your Spotify you've listened to Buddy Holly by Weezer 16,000 times, which I am also not guilty of. And I think this is why it's really important not to be so cruel or dismissive to people who might have a more restricted musical taste. It could be your friend with one playlist on Spotify, or the guy who listens to, the same stream on YouTube, or maybe it's your mom who likes the radio station that they only play at like the dentist's office. But if you think that you might fall into this group and you'd like to broaden your musical horizons a little bit, that's amazing. It takes a lot of courage to do that. Give yourself a pat on the back. And it's my personal hope that if you watch a few more of my videos, just through sheer exposure, you'll start liking them a little bit more, and maybe you'll even subscribe. I am so bad at self-promotion, it's insane. I know this video was more of a chat kind of than what I usually do. I usually do more kind of deep dives into genres and types of music, and I'll get back to that really soon. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.